Welcome to your last tutorial of the semester. You can cheer, it's okay. I know you're ready for it. This last topic will be the nervous system. We'll start with some basic building blocks and then work our way up. Let's start with just the basic building block of the nervous system. That's a neuron, a single cell. There are different types of neurons, but I'm just going to draw a basic neuron for you. Now with the neuron, you start with a cell body. The cell body here has a nucleus, and it receives information. All these little guys are called dendrites. So this is the cell body. These are dendrites. They are receiving information from other neurons, processing it at the cell body, and then decide whether or not to continue the information on down along the axon, all the way down to the axon terminal. At the end of this axon, it will then synapse onto another nerve or structure, its target structure. So every time that one neuron touches another neuron, it's considered a synapse. One way to think of this, you may remember this from being a child, but you could get in a circle in a group and you put your hands like this, and the person next to you would put their hand on top of yours, right? You'd put your hand on top of them. So when one person hits your hand, then you'd hit the next person. Do you remember that game? It's almost like dominoes. That's how a synapse works with a neuron. A neuron receives information, decides whether or not it should continue sending that information, and as it sends that information, it then touches the next neuron. So it's really just a game of telephone or a game of dominoes hitting the next one all the way down the road. When we look at the nervous system, we're talking about neurons, but there's a lot of neurons altogether. So let's organize some of this nervous system. With the nervous system, one organization we use is afferent versus efferent. Afferent information is sensory information from your body. Efferent information is information that's going out of your body. So if you think about when you put your hand on something hot, you're receiving afferent information along your nervous system to your spinal cord and on up to your brain to relay, ow, that hurts. That's all, the whole pathway is afferent information. As soon as it reaches your spinal cord and reaches your brain, both of them, out of protection, have the ability to send signals, efferent signals, to your biceps to tell your biceps to contract and remove your hand from the surface that's hot. It's a protective mechanism, right? It's a reflex, but it includes afferent and efferent effort from the nervous system. Another division of the nervous system that we like to use is central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system consists of the brain, brainstem, spinal cord. When we look at spinal nerves coming off and going to our hands and our feet, when we look at cranial nerves coming off of the brain and innervating other structures in our face and in our neck and in our abdomen, they're moving out. They're peripheral nerves. So central nervous system is going to be the brain, the cerebrum, and the spinal cord. Okay, so central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. For this week, we're going to focus on central nervous system. I will go ahead and tell you about peripheral nervous system, but for this week, you can stop at central nervous system. For our central nervous system, the brain, also known as the encephalon, has four major regions to it. There's the cerebrum that we think of with kind of the big portion we think brain. It's that bumpy portion, right? And then we have the cerebellum that's located what almost looks like a mini brain underneath inferiorly to the cerebrum. Then we have the brainstem, which goes down into the spinal cord, and the diencephalon that really will make a mid-sagittal section, and it'll be easier to see the diencephalon from that angle. So let's start with the cerebrum as we talk through central nervous system. The cerebrum, as you look at it, this is looking straight on. You can see this almost a division right down the middle. This is your central sulcus. A sulcus are any of the dips and the divots that you see. All along the brain, you'll see these bumps, and those are called gyri. Gyri and sulci, or a gyrus and a sulcus. So this is a central sulcus, and it divides our cerebrum into a right and a left hemisphere. Two different sides of the brain. As we look at the brain, we also have areas that we categorize based off of location and based off of function. What's nice is you already know the names of the lobes because they're named for the same skull bone that lies on top of it. So in the front here, what do you think this right and left lobe is called? Frontal lobe. As we move posteriorly, what do you think these lobes on either side are called? Parietal lobe. Back lobes, occipital lobe. On the side, kind of just above the ear area, temporal lobes. So you learned it with the skull. Now you know it already for the brain. Now each of those areas have specific functions. Like sight, if you have an injury to your occipital lobe, it can interrupt sight. Injury to your frontal lobe can interrupt judgment. Temporal, hearing, there's different aspects of function that are unique to each of not only these lobes, but also even hemispheres at times. When we look at the cerebrum, the outside looks gray. But if you were to make a sagittal section, a parasagittal section of it, when you look inside, you would also see white. So there's gray matter and white matter. Now, if you remember back when we talked about a neuron, the cell body often looks gray. And the axon is myelinated with these kind of rings of fat that allow for a faster conduction to occur. Those tracks, those axons, look white to us. These cell bodies look gray. And since the brain is really the cerebrum is that processing center, the conscious awareness of things, it would make sense that we would end on cell bodies who get to decide what we're going to do next before they synapse. So gray matter is on the outside in the cerebrum. When we get to the spinal cord, you'll see it's actually flip-flopped, that the gray matter's on the inside, the cell bodies are on the inside because our spinal cord is mostly tracks, axons, that are trying to transmit information from a higher source to a lower source or receive afferent information from lower to higher. Those are tracks. So in the cerebrum, gray matter's on the outside, and on the inside is white matter, and it's flip-flopped when we look at the spinal cord. If we were to take and make a couple of cuts through the brain here, I'm going to try and do this without dropping it on the floor. We'll see what happens. So if we were to take a mid-sagittal section of the brain, which sounds easier said than done. All right, mid-sagittal section. So cut right down the middle and open it up. You will see some areas that are called ventricles. Now, the first and second ventricle, which are right and left ventricles, because they're both kind of off-center, those are first and second ventricles. Then they come midline, and you find third and fourth ventricle. These ventricles are just hollow areas. If you make the cut, it looks hollow, but they're filled with a structure called choroid plexus that creates cerebrospinal fluid. It creates that cerebrospinal fluid and then comes out by the cerebellum and bathes the entire outside of our nervous system as well, that central nervous system. So cerebrospinal fluid is made in the ventricles, then leaves the ventricles and bathes the outside of the neural structures as well. When we look at protective structure around our nervous system, there are three main layers. We call them meninges. And if you look at the brain, the first layer that is adhered most closely to the brain is going to be the pia mater, P-I-A, pia mater. And then as you move out from that, you will get this layer that kind of looks like cobwebbing. So we call it the arachnoid mater. So it's kind of spiderish, spiderwebbish, so we call it arachnoid mater. In between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is where that cerebral spinal fluid will run. That's where we'll find that. Then the most superficial, working our way out, and the toughest, most durable layer is the dura mater. And really, when you cut into the skull, before you get to the brain, you'll really feel that thick, fibrous tissue, that layer, that dura mater, lining the skull before you see arachnoid and pia mater. And the pia mater is really adhered to that gray matter more so. Those are the protective structures of the cerebrum. As we move on down, you've got the cerebellum. So if we were to take side view, a lateral view of the brain, and look inferior to the cerebrum, you find the cerebellum. And the cerebellum looks like a mini version of the cerebrum. It's got the same gyri and sulci, but on a much smaller scale, and it's a smaller structure in general. With the cerebellum, we tend to think balance and coordination with cerebellum. As you move to the brainstem is the most inferior portion of the central nervous system before we hit spinal cord. And at the brainstem, they're just basic reflexes for life. You think heartbeat, respiration, things that you don't have to consciously control, that are involuntary and just continue on in order to sustain life regularly. Now, we've been looking at a lateral view. I am going to shift here, okay? Now, as you shift over with the brainstem, there are a couple of sections that you will see. With the brainstem, you have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Medulla is the most inferior portion of the brainstem. If you go superior to that, you'll see this area considered the diencephalon. It consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, with the hypothalamus, it gives a stalk off to the pituitary gland. And with the hypothalamus, we tend to think of more of hormone control. We think of circadian rhythms like sleeping cycle. And it has influence over our pituitary gland. As you move inferior from diencephalon, brainstem, you end in the spinal cord. And that runs the length of our vertebrae until about L2. At the lumbar vertebrae number 2, we start to see it become an end. It ends in a cone shape, and then it becomes more of just the spinal nerves coming out. And as we begin to talk about spinal nerves, that will be peripheral nervous system. So let's switch over to peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system are your spinal nerves and your cranial nerves. Spinal nerves come off of your spinal cord. And what's neat is based off of our skeleton, spinal nerves are named and numbered for where they come out. Now, if you remember, cervical vertebrae, there's 7. Thoracic vertebrae, 12. Lumbar, 5. Cranial nerves match up with that. So cranial nerves, C1 is cervical cranial nerve, spinal nerve, cervical nerve 1. And they come out in between each of these vertebrae, a right and a left. Now, they come out between each one, but in between cervical vertebrae 7 and the first thoracic vertebrae, you will note that there's an extra nerve. And so cervical actually has 8 different nerves, spinal nerves. So C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8. When they come out of the neck, they actually go towards our armpit. And a few of the thoracic actually contribute as well. As they go to the armpit, to the axilla, they cross over one another. Just like we saw collateral circulation, we start to see kind of a mixing of some of these roots of these nerves together, and you get what's called a brachial plexus. It's kind of this webbing of all of these different spinal nerve levels coming together so that when they go out into your arm, multiple levels contribute to different functions of different muscles in order to function. That's true from cervical all the way down to sacral. So lumbosacral plexus, we start to see the end of the spinal cord at L2, and then it kind of becomes these, almost looks like a horsetail. It's called the cauda equina, and it's spinal nerves that are continuing on down through the lower extremity into the reproductive area and on down. And you see the same kind of webbing again, where lumbosacral, each level overlaps one another and contributes multiple levels so that if one level's injured, it doesn't knock out the entire muscle, It just may be weaker in that area. So those are spinal nerves. Cranial nerves come off of the brain itself, but they're headed out peripherally. So they're going to affect things like muscles of facial expression, taste buds. They even go down into your abdomen and aid with some of the digestion and other functions along there. So I'm going to erase this neuron, and I am going to give you a mnemonic device to help you remember cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are numbered like Roman numerals, 1 through 12. And this is the funniest saying. It makes no sense, but it's very helpful. So the saying is, on old Olympus's towering tops, a Finn and German viewed amber hops. So like a wheat field, right? So let's take the first letter of each one. On old Olympus towering tops, I'll keep down here. Finn and German viewed amber hops. Okay? Now they're based off of Roman numeral, so 1, 2, 3, and so on. This will help you remember the order of the cranial nerves. First one is olfactory. That deals with the sense of smell. Second one is optic, vision. So each of these nerves, they may be only afferent, bringing in information, olfactory, optic. They may be only motor, sending out commands for your body to do something, or they can be mixed, where they have some sensory afferent input and some motor efferent output. Oculomotor. What do you think that might do? Oculo, eye, motor, movement. It deals with movement of the eye, vertical and lateral. Trochlear. Trochlea refers to a pulley, and the trochlear muscle of the eye actually runs through like a pulley system, and it is able to pull your eye in a diagonal direction. So the trochlear nerve deals with diagonal movement of the eye. Trigeminal. How many branches do you think the trigeminal nerve might have? 3. So it's a 3-branched nerve, and it deals with muscles that help with chewing. It does multiple things. It's mixed, motor, and sensory. That'll kind of help you start thinking through that. Then we have abducens nerve. Abducens, remember A, B, D, abduction, take away from. Abducens nerve helps with abducting the eye. Facial nerve deals with muscles of facial expression. Again, it has other functions as well. That's kind of an easier one to help you remember. Acoustovestibular. Acoustovestibular deals with hearing and balance your vestibular system. Glossopharyngeal. Glossopharyngeal. Glosso refers to tongue. So we're thinking about taste, even movement with some of the swallowing muscles through there. Glossopharyngeal. Vagus nerve. Woo! This is called the vagus nerve because it does a lot. It wanders everywhere. It comes from the term vagabond, which is a wanderer. So the vagus nerve actually starts up here, coming off the brainstem, and wanders all the way down through your thoracic cavity and into your abdomen as well. So it does a lot of stuff, and it wanders as it does that. Then we have our accessory nerve that deals with muscles of the head and neck, like your trapezius muscle. And then we have our hypoglossal. Hypoglossal nerve, hypo, under, glossal, tongue, and it deals with movement of the tongue. This is just a basic overview. You need to go back through your lecture, go back through your textbook, and capture all of the basic functions, either afferent, efferent, or mixed, that these guys do. But I wanted to show you just a neat little mnemonic device to help you remember all of these terms. So you've now had central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and you've just finished your last tutorial video. I've enjoyed being with you this semester. I hope that you've learned a lot. You feel empowered and encouraged as you move forward into more curriculum, and that you feel empowered for your boards at the end. But before the boards, pass your final exam and study hard. Good luck.